Just a week to go, our last media review, I think, before the big vote. We'll have one more. Joining me now, Eamon O'Neill, investigative journalist and lecturer, and Stuart Cosgrove, Channel 4 and presenter too.
Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, John.
Right, a lot happened today. Before we kick off and look at some of the topics, obviously Alex Salmond speaking, and I'll read this out, shall I? He's accused the Treasury of deliberately leaking market-sensitive information about the Royal Bank of Scotland and its decision to relocate registered headquarters to London if there's a yes vote in the referendum. Mr Salmond's demanded an official inquiry charging the Westminster government of, in quotes, blatant bullying and intimidation. And in a letter to staff this morning, the chief exec of RBS, Ross McEwen, said the decision to relocate its legal home was a technical procedure and would not involve moving operations nor people. Stuart first.
First of all, John, I think it's good that you have just quoted what you've quoted directly, that this would have no operational purpose in Scotland and it wouldn't affect jobs, etc. Because I think that elsewhere in the media and elsewhere within this organisation, the last 24 hours have allowed people to assume that this is about job losses in Scotland and the loss of great significant kind of investment. It clearly now is not, and yet another story, when investigated the day after, is proved to not have anything like the substance. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a debate to be had. What I am saying is that there's a tendency in the journalism, in the world that we're currently in, of big beasts, as they're often referred to, arriving in Scotland and saying things which a day later become palpably not true, or at very best exaggerated. And so I'm glad you've actually cleared it up and put into the public domain actually what's happening, because as soon as people heard that, including clients and investors in the Royal Bank of Scotland, they challenged it and found out from the chief executive that there would be no job losses. So why was it leaked to the City of London that there would be?
I agree with Stuart 100%. This should have been challenged immediately by the media. They should have had the information ready to challenge it. It's something that has been floating around since the middle of August, that RBS were considering doing this. I think Alex Salmond, the First Minister, is quite correct to say that he wants to go ahead and challenge the mechanics of how this information got out into the public domain. I think in the interconnected world we live in, especially in the financial realm, the fact that money can move in, a keystroke, and it's very significant that this has been lingering over the last 12 hours or so, 24 hours, that it's finally getting challenged, and they're being forced to actually say exactly what it means, which is, he said the word technicality. It's literally moving a brass plate, as far as I can see. I have to say one thing though, that for anybody who has read the magnificent book Shredded by the wonderful journalist Ian Fraser, which I regard as one of the best investigative books of the past decade that this country has seen, they will realise that RBS here has got a very checkered history, to put the best face on it. And of course, remind listeners that 81% of that is owned by us, the taxpayers. So in many ways, if you were wanting to be a little bit cynical about it, you could actually say that anything RBS says, given their past management track record, would be an indication that possibly right-thinking people would go in the opposite direction. But as far as the media scrutiny of this goes, I think Stuart Cosgrove is 100% correct. It should have been nailed as the nonsense it was when it came out at first. And that's not from a political perspective, I'm saying that, John. That's from a purely journalistic one. That is our job, to scrutinise this and to tell the people out there who own 81% of this bank exactly what that statement meant.
Let me ask the journalist a question. And why would they move this to England? Why would they do this?
Well, I think that to do with the technicality of the banking world, my understanding is that this particular organisation believes that they want to register their headquarters in London, but let's be honest about this. This is an organisation whose substantial debt was racked up through their American organisation, which was registered in the USA. We're in a world of global banking, and the idea that a bank could shift to Frankfurt, and they would. The Royal Bank of Scotland would shift their base to Frankfurt if there was profit in it for them, or rather if there was tax variation in it for them. And the idea that this...
So will they pay us less tax? Will they pay more tax to England, less tax to us? Is that why they've done it?
Well, hey, it would
it's
be
a valid question.
It is a very valid question. Except that it's flawed in one fundamental respect as a question, Ross. John.
We've got names wrong all through the programme today.
Sorry, my apologies, John. It's flawed in one fundamental respect. is that they are a deeply indebted company. And the idea that they don't pay tax is actually risible. It would be good if they did pay tax, and then there might be something to argue about. I'd push this further because I'm with Eamon on this. The lack of scrutiny of this and the idea that people just wanted scare headlines, I think is an outrage, particularly at this stage in the referendum when there's so much to talk about and where our journalism, should be coming alive. The idea that people just simply take the scare. Let's just take the BP example. We are being told that BP are moving to London. Really? So what exactly are they going to do, given that the £200 million they've recently invested in offshore drilling technology? Where are they going to be drilling? Hemel Hempstead? Of course they're not. Their asset, the key asset that they've got off the shores of Britain, are in Scotland's territorial waters, and they are not moving to London. It is just nonsense. And what's happened is, if you look at BP, in whose offices did David Cameron and the Cabinet bring the last time they were here, the first time ever in the history of the Union that the Cabinet has met in Aberdeen? They met in the offices of an oil company. What does it tell you, that? Okay. The optics of it. What does it tell you?
Let's move on. Has this been covered even-handedly? Has it been portrayed even-handedly? The three leaders coming to Scotland from Westminster, the whole counter-accusation and accusation about Prime Minister's questions being cancelled, which it wasn't cancelled. Has this been handled evenly? And who hasn't been even?
There is a there's been a gigantic wedge of theatricality involved in this week. First of all, the fact that you've got the equivalent of these sort of three amigos coming over the border to sort things out. The Prime Minister that's how important things are. He's cancelling question time. He didn't. He's putting a flag above Downing Street.
It got stuck.
That fell down. They tried again. Well, that's very nice. Whatever you think of that, exactly how was it covered when they came up? Well, I suppose there was a degree of drama involved when he came up, but I'll tell you something, again from a journalistic point of view, it backfired, John, because the optics yesterday showed a Prime Minister who was ferried in and out in a black Range Rover in an underground car park to a Serious Financial Houses HQ up in Edinburgh. It looked as if he was behind the fortress there, and a Prime Minister who was elected and who did not walk up and down the street in Edinburgh. So while he's in there sitting in his chair, telling everyone that he desperately wants to hold the Union together, the First Minister's walking the street and taking selfies. So, I mean, no matter what you think about who you support one way or another, the pictures looked, on one hand, as if one person was hiding and the other person was out there basking in the way that the polls are going and the way the trend seems to be going. And if the Prime Minister's handlers clearly were frightened, or at least apprehensive, of letting him go out in the street. I mean, I was reading this morning that down my neck of the woods, Nick Clegg was sent down to the wild environs of Selkirk, and he was heckled. Now, and he was told, nobody wants you here, go away. Now, whatever you think of the heckling and so on, it's clear that the Prime Minister yesterday came up and he spoke not so much to the people on the street, but down the camera lenses. And I felt as if, in a curious way, although he probably thinks he's getting the message across, it may actually look, the pictures, the mediation of it through the media may look like too little, too late.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to challenge, and I think it's something that we'll need to talk about once the referendum's over, and I think it has a significant impact on this particular institution, the BBC, which is, what is the nature of balance and due impartiality? And yesterday I was watching very closely the BBC news, the rolling news, 24-hour news, and it was clear that notions of balance were being predicated on a party political basis. So it would go from Cameron to Miliband to Clegg, and back to, and that was what was going on. Now, if you look at it as a different prism, and it's a yes-no question, which is what's on the referendum paper, then Patrick Harvey of the Greens, who is not the leader but is a significant political person within the Yes campaign, should have had exactly the same coverage as Ed Miliband. Do you think for a second he got that? Of course he didn't. And that's the way where I just think there's been a failure of an understanding of the nature of balance and due impartiality impartiality. And it's simply wrong and not acceptable.
I would agree, and I think that the BBC needs to be part of that discussion, if not one of the leaders in it, and exactly how we go forward and cover politics in the future. That said, can I just say one thing, John, about, again, the visuals, the way that the campaign has been run, because I find it fascinating the way that some of these has been captured by the media. But I think it's telling, and I just want to throw it out there, that you got the impression that the No Better Together campaign, I felt, were caught on the hoof. They are reacting to events when it was announced that the Prime Minister, Clegg and Miliband were going to come up, because suddenly you had Ruth Davidson, Joanne Lamont and other people all standing outside the Parliament with signs. The signs were clearly printed hastily because you couldn't read what was on them in the camera. Then it went off to see the Yes campaign. They were outside. They had all the pre-printed signs in different languages with a tableau that looked like United Colours of Benetton outside wherever it was in Edinburgh, and purely from political management delivering pictures to the media process, it looked to me as if there was only one side that were ahead of this and not in a reactive position. And I think as of today that's something that's very interesting, because they have clearly anticipated where things are going, whereas I feel personally, and as a journalist looking at it, the No Better Together campaign are reacting to events as opposed to actually being out in front of them.
Well, Speaker, obviously it would be in the interest of some people to destabilise the BBC. That's the nature, and usually people in power hate the BBC, don't they? Normally, So normally you could argue that the Scottish government...
It's a whipping boy.
Yeah, whatever happens, the BBC will be criticised.
But for the avoidance of doubt here, John, that is not my desire, nor is it the desire of Eamon as much as we've ever talked about that. Our desire, and I think we share this, is to the belief that the BBC should have much greater relative autonomy in Scotland to tell stories relevant to Scotland, rather than being boxed in the way that it is. Just look at the coverage on any of the channels, and suddenly people that have not been part of this debate are flown up to Scotland to give some fake status to things, and you have people dotted all over hillsides in Edinburgh doing special reports, and it's this big status thing. Oh, London's arrived at last, and I just think that the BBC should be better than that.
To be fair, Stuart, you would do the same if Obama came. I know it's not the same state. I know
no,
you're going to.
It certainly isn't.
I think that's an overstatement, John.
I know, but you can't say you don't cover something just because they're from South.
No, I'm not saying that. The point that I'm saying is
there was too much emphasis.
The point that I'm saying is that you have the quite ludicrous situation of a London-based senior anchor asking what the thoughts are to a political correspondent from Scotland on the side of a hill. Why don't you have the political correspondent from Scotland presenting that bit of the programme?
I would agree. I mean, there is, whether you like it or not, an implicit message being sent out when you have Hugh Edwards interviewing Brian Taylor. There is a message being sent out. I'm sorry. Brian Taylor arguably should be the man that's anchoring this. He should be interpreting it, mediating it for the rest of the UK, not the reverse. It's almost as if they're missing the fact that, and arguably could be said that Hugh Edwards coming up and doing that is actually part of the story.
Okay, expand on this. Is this the same thing as the Commonwealth Games, that what you've got is on a much bigger stage? Just expand on this.
I think that there's an element of truth in this. I mean, yes, I do think that. What I would go on to say is that we have got a situation where our national broadcaster, the BBC, which is funded by the licence and therefore is universally funded by all of the people across the UK, including Scots, and I benefit from it because I present a show on it, and it's an institution I have got deep commitment to and belief in. But I've always felt that the idea of BBC Scotland's opt-out capabilities are far too small, far too squeezed and not autonomous enough. And therefore, as a consequence of that, TV that goes out on the network is seen as real telly, and stuff that goes out in Scotland is seen as lesser, less well-funded and somehow of less importance. And then when there's big events, what happens is the troops move in, and you have a situation where it just always remind yourself that Scotland clearly doesn't have the autonomy it needs around its media.
I would think that, going back to almost journalism first principles, I think that this is a classic case of what they call bigfooting, which is where the anchors fly in and bigfoot the locals that have done all the hard work, etc. And I feel in a sense that has happened here. It shouldn't have happened. That is part of the national conversation that we are part, as journalists, are part of as well. This should have been something which the best will in the world should have been decided a year, 18 months ago. Maybe let's take a different tack on this, because it feels to me all so predictable journalistically at a time when in fact there might have been a new rule book, or at least a page or two in that rule book to be written, to actually surprise us by saying, actually, you know what, this is a story, it's a once in a 300-year story. It should be something that the journalism talent at Pacific Quay in Scotland, at BBC Scotland, should be leading on to tell the rest of the country what's happening, because they are the journalists who are literally in the front lines of this story. So Hugh, you can stay where you are. Thanks very much, but we'll actually hear from the people that are up there reporting on it, because I'm sure it's within their skill set to mediate and tell the rest of the country exactly what's happening in this part of the United Kingdom.
Before we move on, obviously Sky is more global in its coverage, and Channel 4 likewise doesn't have a local opt-out. Yeah. Are we the only broadcast organisations have done this? Do ITV plainly send up their own anchors, have their own news up?
Well,
not
yes,
just the BBC
but the ITV system's slightly different in as much as STV is a standalone organisation that is not dependent on ITV
then
for
they're
its feed.
big-footed too.
Yeah, well, but the thing about it is that they've got a licence to operate here in Scotland.
No, I'm not. But you're accusing the BBC, and I'm just saying, and I'm not justifying what I'm trying to say.
I know you're not, John.
It appears as though we're the only people doing this, but plainly not.
No, I know exactly, and I know exactly what you're saying and what's behind it, and I understand. I agree. What I'm saying is, OK, that's the way it was done. Maybe this was a time to actually rewrite a new rule book and turn the page. Journalism is an evolving process, and this would have been one of those occasions we could have reacted to it and maybe done something different. Time's gone, too late. The horse is bolted.
Yeah. OK, let's move on, shall we, to other matters of global importance. This is ISIS, the threat and the NATO response. This is response via Obama and a coalition of 10 and a statement.
Well, it was fascinating because it came out, of course, while we're up here in this big bubble of the referendum. This came out of NATO meeting, the 28 nations of NATO meeting down at Newport in Wales. A huge meeting of huge significance, comes against the backdrop of all those terrible atrocity videos that have came out, the murder of James Foley and the next journalist that was murdered as well, and of course the threat to this Scotsman that's out there in the desert being captured by ISIL as well. And there was a sense about 10 days ago that President Obama was drifting on this. He actually said at the podium when he was coming from his holiday in Martha's Vineyard, when he stood up there and he said the US doesn't have a strategy in this. Now, on one hand, you may have said he was telling the truth, on the other hand, he was letting slip something which did not give much succour to people that would be hoping he would have a strategy, and also it gave much red meat to the Republicans on the other side of the aisle to say, good God, there go the Democrats again. They can't organise anything to do with this country's safety and defence and homeland security. So here he is in, of all places, Wales, issuing a statement saying that there's going to be, out of the 28 nations, there are at least, I think, 10 signed up to this. But what was interesting about it wasn't boots on the ground. This was not George W. Bush, war on terror, sending in the CIA guys on the ground in Afghanistan. This was him talking about upping the drone attacks, upping a war, using intelligence against terrorism, which means the military wing of the CIA. But what was fascinating about it, two lines that came out, it was, where are the Islamic nations getting involved in this? It was only Turkey that was mentioned. So are we going to see more of them coming forward? Are we going to see the United States making top-level contacts with Iran? Despite the problems they've had historically, are we now going to see the United States arming rebels in Syria, which they said they would never do before, and in terms of take the fight back against them over there as well? And of course, the other story that came out was connected to the referendum, which was the notion that an independent Scotland would only pay 1.7% of its GDP towards defence, when you're actually to be a fully paid up member of the club means 2%, but that backfired on them because it turns out that most of the nations, 24 out of the 28, don't pay 2%. So it was a fascinating sort of press conference that was held there. It spun off in all sorts of directions, and you can see John Kerry out there at the moment talking about it and trying to sell this programme. But clearly what's happening is the takeaway message is there's not going to be any fast solutions. They see ISIL as a long-term problem that needs a long-term solution.
And Scott,
sorry, it's okay, Jim.
Okay, Elvis.
In amongst it all, there's a Scottish hostage. And
yes.
If other matters hadn't been happening, that would have been the massive story. There's a Scotsman out there on video.
Yeah, and
awaiting a fate.
Again, we go back to the feelings around Foley as well, that you feel very, very, very deeply for the people connected here, and it's always one of those things that the gentleman's from Tayside, so on my Facebook feed I know people who know him and know his family, and that sense of the localness of it gets to you in ways that probably it doesn't when it's someone else from another nation. You still feel for them in a human sense, but not in that kind of closer to home sense.
And the point too, the coverage of him and his fate's been submerged in what's happening. happening.
Yes, I think that's right, and you can have, and often it can happen, is that breaking news or big news or umbrella news can actually dampen down a story that you thought was going to be the story of the day. We're actually maybe just sitting through it just now, because from the perspective of these announcements that have now corrected the misrepresentations of yesterday, that Royal Bank of Scotland staff will not be moved from Scotland, that's being overshadowed by the Oscar Pistorius trial, which is coming to its conclusion. So in lots of ways, there's always that sense of a rolling news agenda where a big story bursts and can actually outshadow another one.
Okay, let me change the script and just have a glance over the next week. Eamon, what's going to happen? What's going to happen in media terms?
In media terms, I think they're going to be... The journalists will be pretty numb by now, because this is a very unusual long campaign. People are really starting to get that zombie end of the presidential election.
But you get the sense, given text coming in here, people are getting more and more engaged.
They do.
We've been at it for years. People are getting more engaged, both ways.
You were asking about the media. I think that the media are one thing, but I think people will, the way that the trends tend to go, and research shows is that people get more engaged as they run up to the date itself. I think that will happen as things go forward. I repeat my sense as a journalist that the Yes campaign have got a much stricter, more focused and disciplined campaign on the go just now. It'll be interesting to see if No One Better Together get on the front foot and start to take control of the media and the stories and the events, the press events, the optics, more than they have. But at the moment, there is a sense that one side has actually got a timetable it's working towards and the other side isn't.
More debates. There'll be there's a couple of more polls to come, but the thing I think that will tip it in the end is that across Scotland we've had the most wonderful and often actually quite joyous conversation about the future of our country, and I think that the Yes campaign, not through its kind of control the way that Eamon says, but through these autonomous groups throughout Scotland, you can't move anywhere in Scotland without seeing it. It's quite impactful.
Eamon, what's
last word, let's see if the Scotsman coming out in favour of no and everything, let's see how that plays out in the next week. It's interesting.
And does milk get sour in summer?
All right. Eamon, Stuart, thank you very much indeed, as always.